Since the first mobile call made on 31st July 1995, Indian telecom sector has grown as the second largest telecom market in the world, connecting India affordably and transforming our society. Despite the huge diversity in terrain, culture, user base, climate and constrained power supply and high population density, Indians enjoy the lowest telecom tariffs in the world. Therefore, our requirements are different from other regions. The global telecom standards ecosystem has been dominated by 3GPP and IT. However, India's contribution was not significant until the mid-2010s. A need for an Indian telecommunication standards development organization that can reflect the diverse needs of our market and promote our IP on the global stage was felt. This was acknowledged in the National Telecom Policy in 2012.
I would expect a standard society to articulate India's concern on the international stage, which are India specific, and the world must listen to that. Because I see electronic manufacturing and communication technology also merging at some point of time.
TSDSI is an autonomous, membership-based body comprising entities from across the telecom ecosystem and application verticals. We are recognized by DoT as India's telecom SDO. Soon after inception, we became organizational partner of 3GPP and joined the 1M2M partnership, and the journey continues with further partnership agreements being signed up with other global forums. TSDSI's vision is to ensure that digital communication standards increasingly drive domestic economic and policy activities, thereby creating a leadership position through India's position in emerging digital communication standards in global SDOs. Our technical activities are carried out in two study groups: networks and services and solutions. Standards development falls into three phases: pre-standards, standards and post. Our roadmap is driven by this philosophy, and specific topics are taken up in task forces and technology item proposal forums. TSDSI, in a relatively short span of 6 years, has made a mark in the standards world. TSDSI standards taken by Telecom Engineering Center for adoption as national standards. Our latest accomplishment is the incorporation of the TSDSI 5G radio interface technology as an independent technology in the ITU-R specifications for IMT 2020. Technology development cycles shrink, spurred by softwareization and disaggregation. India, traditionally a software powerhouse and a huge market, has an opportunity to take a leadership position in the global technology landscape. IP and standards will drive the economic growth. With RIT becoming part of the global IMT 2020 specifications, India is poised to play a more active role in the global standards arena. Design local, deploy global. Join us to deliver more such solutions that hit specific requirements of the developing world based on indigenous IP.
We move to the next session, role of open source in 5G deployment. I introduce the chair of the session, Dr. Inder Gopal, TSIDC Open Initiatives Task Force, Indian Institute of Science, Bangalore. Sir, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I hope everyone can hear me. I guess you saw the little movie clip about TSDSI, and one question is, TSDSI is about open standards. So why are we talking about open source? The reason really is that telecom becomes more software driven. Many people actually believe that open source will become a major new way of defining standards. And many standards will emerge really from the open source community and then become part of the standardization process. And several factors drive this. Obviously the softwareization, if you will, of the telecom industry, driven by disaggregation. We heard a lot about that in some of the previous sessions. The separation of hardware, the adoption of white box solutions based on commodity hardware, and then the disruptive nature of open source, right? And we've already seen the disruptive nature in the software industry. For example, Linux, was a huge disruptor. And in the telecom sector, you see some similar kind of trends. The willingness of large carriers to adopt open source and really use that as a vehicle to avoid lock-in with incumbent vendors and have more of their destiny under their own control. And you also see the willingness of vendors to operate on platforms, on the kind of the core platforms, and really to make them to more effectively compete on differentiators and higher margin components. So a lot of the base technology, can be, right? There's not huge differentiators in that. And so there's more willingness you see on vendor side to do those kinds of things. And the third factor that's driving it is really a drive for dynamism, right? And as the telecom industry moves towards a software architecture on NFV and SDN principles, you really want to see more faster, more dynamic service creation, and that needs actually a more dynamic standards process as well, right? And we've seen, for example, in the networking space, right, with software-defined networking, a complete transformation of that industry, right? From the role of open source has become really dominant in that space, and we think that potentially there could be all kinds of transformation occurring in telecom, and the collaborative open source bodies which curate and manage open source development can become a complement, and in some cases perhaps even an alternative to traditional standards bodies, and create a whole new paradigm telecom standards. So this is something that is of great interest to TSDSI. And what we have done, is initiated a task force to look at this area, particularly in the context of 5G. And that is of our first talk. This session is going to be in 3 parts. What we'll do is initially have a couple of talks, roughly about 15 minutes each, and we'll try to keep to 15 minutes or less. And then we will have a panel discussion with a bunch of very eminent panelists who will discuss the role of open source and the topic of viability and feasibility of open source in 5G. And that will be roughly about an hour. And then if we have some time, we may open it up for questions from the audience. So with that, let me introduce our first speaker. Our first speaker is Mr. Manish Gange from Airtel. Manish is a senior VP at Airtel, where he's responsible for bringing disruptive technologies to Airtel's networks. And he's driving initiatives around open network and standardization ecosystems. And he is the co-chair of the TSDSI Open Initiatives Task Force. So with that, let me turn it over and request Manish to give his presentation. Manish?
All right. Yeah, I'm just looking for uploading my PPT, or is the PPT already being played? Can we go?
I think it's. I'm not sure what the. I think it's already. Yeah, there it is. Yeah. That looks like your presentation, right?
Yeah. Can we go to the next slide, please? Next slide, please. Yeah. So I think Inder has set up a right context for the open source task force that we put in place. But beyond what the open source can do globally and in the context which are wide ranging, we were looking at what it can do for specifically with the 5G happening in India and those the deployments which are pertaining to India. There is always a question in everybody's mind: can open source be used for building a commercial network of an operator which has got a variety and the complexity that is needed, that is there in terms of number of users, the density, and whatnot, right? So that's the question that we thought we should try and answer. Aspects of 5G ecosystem can benefit from the open source is another question that we should be trying to answer. And if there are anything, any specific problem statements that we can talk about from the India's perspective, and see if there is open source, an open source component available to address that. One thing that has been, our belief, and that's why, again, I said is one of the key driver of the task force is open source. When you actually build the product that you can deploy, right? What sort of open source renders itself to such an such a objective? Typically, and if you look at all the parallel examples into the other industries and the data center and the networking and everywhere else, typically you will find the common functions, the functions which are very generic in nature, the functions which have to be built, have to be in place before you can start to think about adding the new capabilities or the innovative capabilities and turn that into a product. So once you have the open source, a lot of work that you had to do of the plumbing earlier, you don't have to do it, so you can get done to the next stage of innovation, but a lot faster than you would have been otherwise. So that's another thing that we needed to examine and see if we really, if we really have something we can use in India. And then obviously there's a lot of misconceptions or lack of knowledge or understanding of open source. Right? A lot of people think, if I build something in the open source and I contribute to the open source, I tend to lose out because I will not be able to patent it. I will not be able to copyright it. How then we handle the code that gets developed, which has got a certain key IP? How do you handle? How do you protect? What kind of mechanisms are available for you to be able to protect them if you want to? And if you don't, what are the good reasons why you should not be protecting that IPR? So these were the key drivers, and we set out to find answers. If you go to the next slide, we really set out a task force with a few objectives, right? The questions that I posed are very big, and I don't, we can, in a time-bound study, can answer all the questions. But we set out a few objectives, saying, let's look at it. What are the key components of a 5G, end-to-end 5G ecosystems? What are the key components that we can basically address? What are the key problems in each of these components that we can identify and see if they can be solved using the open source components? Shortlist these open source components, create a study reports which identifies them in terms of various parameters as to how each one behaves against the other, and what are and gaps with respect to the problem statement that were defined. Then the next stage of this task force ambition is that if we can take some of these problem statements and really implement them, show some pilot implementation to demonstrate that these are effective, these really mature implementations that are available, and that can be used for creating a bigger solution or a solution that can be productized and put into the network. So that's one aspect of it. And then final aspect that Inder also alluded to is saying, how does standardization process and the open source development process feed into each other, because there's a lot that you can try out. If you're trying to do a new standard, you can try out using a lot of open source and be able to demonstrate, basically put them into the standards. So this can really feed into each other, or whatever you define, you can choose to implement and showcase. So these are the objectives with which the task force started. Can we go to the next slide? Please. Yeah. And then this task force we prepared, in a specific manner. As I said, right, the task is huge. 5G is a huge domain by itself, and we are saying that do look at it end to end. So we identified 3 sub 5G. What we call the axis. Axis is basically the radio network axis, transport, and then what we call the application subsystem, or applications, which are more giving us an ability to bring in a lot more innovation, right? These applications have to coexist or have to complement what the RAN and transport and the rest of the 5G network has to utilize. So we created 3 sub-teams and then set up the goals for each of the sub-teams. The goals were simple: evaluate whatever exists for the domain that you identified, look at their maturity, look at the experience, try and play around if we can, select some of the the open source and see what is missing, if from the perspective of the problem definition. Yeah, I just want to touch base upon the problem definition. Was another key process in this task force was work with all the industry partners to say, what's the problem statement? How do you define what is needed, right? I mean, and there are many ways of doing it. One is to talk to all the operators, who have been deploying this into the network, and then ask them as to what you need and what is important, what is the high priority, what is the low priority, what is the medium priority. So you define the problem statement in that manner. Also talk to the other industry, players in terms of what capability exists, what we can do and what we cannot do, and then come up with this problem statement, right? So that process has been followed, and then figure out what kind of contributions that we can bring in, and how do we basically harmonize them for global and Indian roadmap, right? So that's the goal that we set up for each team. The next steps of this task force, and which we'll talk towards the end as well, is to be able to define a structure, governance, and operating model, which will allow us to take this initiative to the next level. I mean, first set of the goals are creating the study report, coming up with the implementation options, coming up with some suggested pilots, but then work starts after that. And that would require a certain amount of funding. So we really have to figure out what the sources of funding going to look like. Do we need to involve the government? Do we need to involve the academia? Do we need to involve the industry at large? But how do we use this work to energize the ecosystem in general, for people to start to contribute, in the hope that whatever comes out can be usable by them in their other product building process. So that would be a key success criteria if we were to take this. And of course, evangelization is the key. And this talk that we're doing today and the whole 3-hour session that we're talking about today is geared towards this. How do we energize people to think open source, right? I mean, we've been far too long been contributing as individuals, individual corporations into the open source domain, but we really never adopted them to be utilized at the level that will change the game in terms of bringing in a lot more companies to build products basis the open source components and offer to the customers, right? So that's the operating process on which we worked. If you go to the next slide, the 3 slides will talk about the 3 teams, sub-teams that we have constituted. Can we go to the next slide? As I said, the 3 radiocentric access group, centric, IP-centric, IP network-centric transport group, and then app group, right? A number of companies and the representatives are here. A lot of them are talking here as well today, and in the audience too, who have been, actively participating. We have set up a, each sub-team meets once a week at the minimum in their own, group, and discusses and arrives at, certain decisions, conclusions, and evaluations of the open source that they've identified. And then, have a governing structure in which, every Friday we meet into the entire group and try and assess what has been done and try and remove the barriers, if there are any, in front of any of these teams. So a lot of contribution, a lot of personal time that people have put in to be able to come up with this study. That is actually due in the end of June. And I hope, we would be able to release it for a larger consumption fairly soon after teams submit their reports. So going back to the teams, and if you go to the next slide, I'll talk in terms of what the teams have looked at. So for example, the Axis sub-team looked at, the three aspects, right? There is the open software aspect of open source projects, hardware aspect of the open source project, and then, what are the governing principles, if you were to say that. We are using ORCLE to see, what is defined, and if basis that, what kind of implementations are available. GPP is, of course, at the back of every implementation. And then we're seeing what we can do with the standard or the work done by TSDSI and see if that can be brought into the open source domain as well. So multiple subdomains within this thing had been looked at. People have looked at what is available from OpenAir interface or SRLT, or ORANS itself, open source group has been put in place. Then cloud infrastructure side, what is the Red Hat or ONAP or under the Kubernetes platforms. And then on the hardware side, there are a number of architectures that are existing, which are available, and people can actually buy this hardware and start to code or start to implement or port their software on them fairly quickly. And each of these companies that we mentioned here are very, very encouraging those implementations. So that is the sort of hardware platform that are kind of hardware is available. Intel has been providing a number of platforms. So what kind of dimensioning that you need for a certain kind of network capacity that you need to create. So all this information is being evaluated into and put into the. If you go to the next slide, likewise on the transport side, a number of projects that have been looked at. Team has specifically focused on, again, in the transport domain is pretty huge. You can start at the, if you really look at IP network, core network to aggregator, aggregation network to the access network to the cell site routers. I mean, the transport domain is pretty large. And then underlying that is your optical infrastructure. And you can create, open source based platforms in each of these domains. But so we actually let team choose a smaller, focus area of the transport and then start to evaluate projects that exist in those domains. Again, right, software and hardware both, and then the management aspects or the orchestration aspect of how do you manage these as they start to function into on an individual basis, but then how do you get them into the network and manage them? Again, right, on the hardware side, there are a number of companies which are looking to give you the hardware which you can co-port your open source software on it and then be able to test it out. If you go to the next slide, that's an interesting area that we picked up, and this has been talked about into the earlier sessions a lot, and we call it the Radio Access Network Intelligent Controller, the RIC platform that people have been putting so much emphasis. That's a platform, and that's a enabler, which will bring in a lot more automation, a lot more innovation into the telecom network than what we have seen in the recent past. It's a matter of getting this proliferated, make sure that the infrastructure layer for the RIC is built in a common and standard manner so that people can build their application on top of it. I mean, in many different ways, I liken the RIC platform to Google Play Store or Apple App Store, right? Where people can bring in applications, and the end user can choose what they want to use, right? And everybody has got a model to monetize it. I see that application, especially the RIC, to transform into something of that sort. So there is some work that we've done on this side to identify a common framework that we need to have in place. How do you basically then build things on top of it? If you go to the next slide, and that's my last slide. I hope I've kept time in there. Is basically the expected outcomes. I said, right, there is a report coming that will be a useful guide for anybody who wants to start and say, yeah, what kind of open source projects are available and how do I start to use them? I don't have to go through all this study, all this plumbing work myself to figure out, oh, is this good enough or not, right? So that work is being done in the report. The second thing that we're going to do is in July next month, we're actually talking to all the a large number of academic institutes and trying to propose a few pilot implementations, right? And the reason that we're doing with the academia right now is that we really need participation of the next generation of the engineers that is actually coming out of it. And we felt that this is a platform on which people can learn a lot, contribute to it as well. And then when they come into the industry, it will basically snowball into a much bigger thing. That crop of engineers who's actually living and breathing open source at very, very early in their careers, they would basically grow this into a much bigger movement. And that's why we said we need to focus onto the academic institutes and see if we can bring in the professors and the students together, see if we can challenge them to implement some of these pilot projects that we would be proposing. So that will happen. And then, again, right, we're trying to say if the open source can be used and if you can cut down on the cost of development and engineering, you would basically render yourself much better TCO benefits that you can bring. And I said TCO benefit is extremely important from the India perspective because the ARPUs in this country are so low that if you really want the benefits of the technology to reach all our rural mass and all, we really have to create the right infrastructure at the right cost to be make sure that we can bring them on the telecom revolution. So I think there are much larger goals, much bigger ambitions, but we're starting to take baby steps, and I'm really looking forward to the support from everybody here and in the industry and in academia to support this movement. I mean, we're just trying to ignite a fire. We want to, let this fire grow and really bloom. So that's all I had to say. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Manish. Thank you. And just to Manish said, there will be a report that TSDSI will issue in the coming weeks. When you please look for that, and we will be very eager to get feedback and dialogue around that report. We really see that as a starting point for a much broader. So with that, let's move to our second speaker. Our second speaker really is going to provide the bridge, if you will, between the previous set of sessions and this session. I think we talked previously that a precursor to the source, a necessary precursor, is the disaggregation, right? Disaggregation of the software architecture, disaggregation between hardware and software. And obviously, Open ORAN has, really pushed that in the radio access space. So what our next speaker is going to do is talk a little bit about that and how that enables an open source ecosystem. So let me introduce him. He is Srinivasan Radhakrishnan, who is the chief architect at Sukta. And he is currently focusing on solution definition and IPR development with a special focus on RAN disaggregation, network automation, and network intelligent aspects. So with that, I'll turn it over to Srinivasan to give his talk.
Thank you, Dr. Anga, for a good introduction. I hope everyone can hear me.
Yes, we can hear you.
Yeah, thank you. So let me start. I think we had a good round of presentations and talk in the last session. And like Dr. Inder said, it and leads the pathway to what I'm going to present today. Today, what I'm going to do is sort of define how the Open RAN stage has set in and why it's important in the India-specific scenario, and then diverge on to how the open source could also help. Since it's been a long session, I'll try to keep it brief and try to contain it within the time. So let me get started. Can we go to the next slide, please? Yeah, the next one. Okay, start. So what we see and what we've seen in the evolution is that we've gone over from traditional RAN to an open RAN scenario, and the change has been driven primarily by 5G and the need to have low cost and also have something that is reduce power, environment friendly, and absolutely the sheer number of use cases that 5G has actually generated. So this is the change that we see from traditional RAN and going through the open RAN. The change has been also fueled by the network decomposition, which has happened through disaggregation. Architecture of RAN would not sufficient anymore to address these sort of varied use cases. What is the result of decomposition is that we also see that this allows multi-vendor plug-and-play ecosystem where many players can come in with their different components, put in together and have a ecosystem. I think a lot of the speakers in the last session also talk about all of this. Finally, what we see is with the result of this, we will have a good mix of local as well as global players, which will be together, and then that will really form a diverse ecosystem. Together with all these set, this will enable us to really achieve what 5G set out to achieve. A top-grade innovation, cost effectiveness, as well as being eco-friendly, low on the power. Let's go to the next slide. Okay, so here, this is so much of what, so I'll keep it brief. At the top level, what we have is the traditional RAN architecture, which we see that there is a RU at the first level, followed by what is the base station equivalent called as BBU, finally connecting to the EPC. We know that the front haul interface was there between BBU and RRU and interface to the EPC. The important thing to capture here is that the traditional network did have CIPRI as a front haul interface, which is not a part of 3GPP standard. And many of the implementations did have vendor-specific elements. The BBU itself was not disaggregated, was in one form. And even though the 3GPP had defined many of the elements, the aspects of openness and disaggregation wouldn't come in there. So further on, the management aspects, what the 3GPP defines, are at a high level and not really, can be taken up indirectly. So these were many of the options that were, needed improvements. And the last part is there was no cloudification in the traditional RAN approach. There were efforts which were started, which leads me to the second diagram, where we do see that, in the 3GPP release 15, there is a split that was in there. We see the CU and DU. Disaggregation is what we defined here. But still, the aspects of cloudification into VRAN was not as standard as it is evolving as of today. And therefore, that would lead to some vendor-specific implementations. Same way in the front haul part, 3GPP does not define this. Again, CIPRI implementations would again lead to some sort of, non-standard non-standard implementations. So these aspects finally have been put together and led to the evolution, where we see the last diagram, which is the standard URAN architecture. The CU as OCU and OpenCU, and the DU as OpenDU, followed by the RU, which is also Open RU. So the first thing that comes here is the open frontal interface defined by URAN, which is a critical component, and that takes care of the fact that there is openness between ODU and RU. So therefore, there's end lock-in. Next, we also see that this interfaces implemented by or defined by 3GPP have been taken over and specified to ensure openness. That comes in the disaggregated interfaces in terms of the F1 and E1. There is an additional component of the management framework realized by URAN on top of what 3GPP has defined. It aims to take the existing forms of 3GPP and put it to a more form which could be taken up and implemented that ensures openness and also the level of disaggregation needed to ensure such an open RAN network. And finally, there is also the introduction of the intelligence framework, where we see that there's a real-time break and there's a non-real-time break, depending on the location of where these components would be, where there is a need to achieve a tighter cycle. The real-time break would take care of that, and then where the cycle could be longer, the processing could be more, the IML, that is a non-real-time break, which is put in the SMO side. So these flavors have been brought in by URAN, and this is really the evolution from a traditional RAN to the open RAN network. Let's go on to the next slide. Okay, so now we transition to where it is and how it is for India. So at India, we're looking at Atmanirbhar Bharat stage, where we are seeing that India as a nation would have a lot of effort towards having a self-sufficient, self-reliant ecosystem towards the telecom infrastructure, as all of the presentations and speak about. So this is the first, and foremost important requirement for us, and where all the companies have invested and moving towards. So therefore, what does it really need? It needs a complete RAN solution. But having a complete RAN solution built out of India, but is not available with either any of the tier ones as well as smaller players. So therefore, there is a need to put it together. And if really one company had to do it, it would take a lot of time, probably in the order of a decade, to achieve this. So therefore, what is the solution? So the key aspects therefore comes as that a lot of players need to come, and they should have diverse use cases. They should have different products which come together effectively to make this happen. And that's where the multi-vendor ecosystem sort of sets in, and it helps to get the system going. So therefore, as we see with the advent of smaller players system in an open disaggregated system, we do see that this is the quickest way to the India-specific use cases. And this would help in taking over this context from the very early stages of deployment, which is very important, because if the readily open disaggregated and is not available, then the cost, the effort invested towards ORAN will become a question. So therefore, it is important that this is available from the very early stage. And since the deployments are almost around the corner in India, we need this system to be readily available. So at the next slide, I would introduce what is important specifically in India context and what we are doing at TSDSI towards that. Let's go to the next slide. So one thing we saw from the previous slide is that there is a need to sort of prioritize what India needs, and it has to be done very quickly. Therefore, at TSDSI, we've taken a start towards analyzing the Open RAN at what stage it is, analyzing what 3GPP has specified, take a look at Open RAN, and then also say where we are with respect to this. Is this really as open, and are there no gaps, and can they be ready for people or companies to take over and deploy? This were talked about, I guess, in the last session as well. So that is the study that we have been taken up. We have started with the analysis of the existing architecture standards and interfaces from 3GPP and URAN for the concepts of openness, disaggregation, as well as the plug and play aspects. So we will study of the interfaces related to management, peer network nodes such as F1, and peer network nodes such as X2, disaggregated network nodes such as F1, and also the core network side of it. So we will start, the focus is to start with the management interface and then slowly cover up to the protocol layers. And then finally, we also hope to take over and study the network intelligence and cloud orchestration aspects, as we believe these are at the early stages in the ORAN Alliance as well, and needs to progress to quite some extent before it gets deployment ready. So therefore, the key aspects here is that we are going to study these interfaces and specify what lies in terms of the gaps, so that at India these could be covered and can lead to the real Atmanirbhar Bharat initiative. What we want to do, therefore, is either we fill up the gaps ourselves and try to harmonize it with the global community. So therefore, there is a unified Open RAN movement. Let's go to the next slide. So finally, I've set the stage to say that what is this diverseness and why there is a need for, and why smaller players, different players need to come in. And that sets the stage for this slide, where we are talking about what can open source do for this and how can it help. We've already seen that an open and a disaggregated system, which is also plug and play, meaning specifically integration time is lessened, open source possibilities. And this can blow up to what we've known as the global collaboration. Some of them we have seen in the already existing open source stages. It brings in the agility that is needed to achieve this, and also this can improve specific focus areas. What this means is that in a lot of different components, even within the RAN, right, that these many components have to come together to achieve this. There is a management component, there's a protocol specific component, there's a disaggregated component. In order to achieve all this, there can be a lot of help that can come from the open source community, focus on certain specific areas, while the other areas can be left to certain RAN developers or very certain specific RAN specific functions as well. So therefore, together this can scale up even the testing and the community support. Some of these concepts were talked about in the last session in terms of a system integration. Finally, this will lead to enable companies to focus on their specific IP or focus on what they do best. Also, this will lead to a larger focus on the intelligence, which is a very, very key aspect of 5G networks. So therefore, we see this as a set stage for open source to come in and achieve the ORAN movement. Let's go to the next slide. Here I briefly listed the categories where we already seen software that has come in. They are at different stages of development, and they are at different maturity stage. The first, the network orchestration and automation. We have seen the names of ONAP, OSM, and Open Button, which are going towards quite a lot of maturity. This is a critical aspect, and it will be needed from the very initial stages. All the goals that 5G has in terms of virtualization and seamless management has to be addressed here. See that there is a lot of maturity towards this, but still, are they ready to get deployed? And how effective it is towards the emerging ORAN standards, that is still a question that needs to be answered. Going to the second category, that is radio access. Here we've seen a number of software from the open source community already. As OAI is already there. There is already an ORAN software community, which almost gives us the reference code and aims to hope to add on more profiles from the ORAN specifications itself. There is also SRS RAN, previously known as SRS LTE, but now it is found where they hope to give 4G as well as 5G solutions. So already in the radio access, we see 3 projects, and I hope that more will be coming in soon. Then let's move on to the network intelligence, which is also a key aspect. We also see that there's a SDRAN efforts towards this, which is aiming to develop the RIC framework. A number of XApps can be developed and deployed. So this is again more and more critical aspect where 5G network needs to think. And we are moving towards all aspects of the system, not just one. Finally, virtualization aspects, where we have seen a lot of mature software already gain a lot of traction in the previous years. To mention a few, there is Red Hat Virtualization Platform, OpenStack, and Kubernetes. So we see that all areas that you can mention, there are already softwares, though they are at different stages of maturities, one ahead of the other, one catching up. And so overall, there's a lot of progress already in this space. And as the evolution happens, I hope that they will be able to achieve more towards going towards a commercially viable software deployment and address the open RAN market space. I think that brings to the end of my presentation. To thank the BHARAT Exhibitions and TSDSI for giving me the opportunity. At Supta, we are developing open RAN solutions and products for 5G, and we've already had a decade worth of experience of developing 4G as well as LTE solutions. We hope to be able to contribute to this ORAN as well as open source towards achieving this. With that, I'll end my presentation. I hope I'm on time. Thank you.
Yes, you're on time, Srinivasan. Thank you. Thank you so much. Nice talk. So now we move to a more open discussion. What we'll do is we have bring our panelists on stage. We have 8 very distinguished panelists who will opine on the feasibility of open source for 5G. And I'm not going to introduce individually, but what I will request them to do is, as they answer their first question, to preface the question by introducing themselves and then move to the answer. So let me pose the first question, and the first question will be to all the panelists sequentially, and this is really the framing question of this panel. It's, do you believe open source? And open source could be the software or software and hardware, is a viable solution within the 5G ecosystem. So that's kind of the main question. If yes, why do you think so? And which part of the 5G ecosystem will be the earliest adopters? If no, why not? And what do you think needs to be done to make open source in the 5G space? So it's a kind of a complex question, but it kind of captures the essence of what we're trying to address. So what I will do is request each of the panelists to address that question. I hope you took notes and you remember it. But, and as I said, preface the answer by briefly introducing yourself. So what we'll do is we'll start with Timo from Red Hat. And then circle around. So Timo, over to you.
Sounds good. You hear me well?
Yes, we hear you perfect.
Good. So introducing myself quickly. My name is Timo Jokiaho. I'm a chief technologist at the Red Hat Global Telco team. Having been here now 7 years, based in Finland, and being a Finnish engineer, of course, I have been a long time at Nokia, but I also have been at Huawei doing radio access networks, for example. Now, short, interesting story about how I was introduced to open source. This you might find this interesting, but it's kind of embarrassing for me. So this is early 90s when Mr. Linus Torvalds at the university, and he started to do the Linux thing and put it all open source. And he told me in the hallways of Helsinki University that, hey Timo, I'm going to put it open source, give it for free, and see what happens. And what I said was that you are crazy, you're completely crazy. It's never going to. But now he reminds me every year, once at least. But you know, having said that, open source is not a disruptor to me at all. It's kind of a mainstream software development techniques, as you know, being a code open operative way of doing things. It is a mainstream. It has been here for 30 years, 25 at least. And in telecom industry, network function virtualization, NFV, which was introduced late 2012, that was a turning point, on my opinion, in telco industry when to be even mainstream well, maybe not mainstream, but at least well recognized and acknowledged way of developing software in telco networks, starting from the core and now going towards radio access network and edge and you name it. In 5G, I think it's given that open source will be there, and open source is there and is going to stay there and will play a major role. And what also helps in 5G is that 5G standardization has taken a completely new approach for standardizing the mode to 2G, 3G, and 4G. They are calling for cloud nativeness. They are calling for containers. They are calling for microservices in the standard. And they are also calling for open source. 3GPP has done extremely good job of promoting open source. So open source is there and will play and is playing a key role. One of the key roles of building 5G networks all over the place is core, OSS, BSS, at least as a platforms, and edge and RAN. I'm not saying, and I'm not even suggesting that it would be open source. There is no need for that. People need to have flexibility, but certain parts of the network should be open source. And I think we're going to talk about that a bit later.
Great. Thank you, Timo. As I would expect someone from Red Hat, you I guess, an affirmative response to that question. So let's move to Jayant from Mavenir and get his perspective and introduction as well.
Yeah. Can you hear me clearly?
Yes, we can. We can hear you, Bob.
Okay. All right, great. Me on this panel. My name is Jayant Moke. I've been with Mavenir for the last about 1.5 years. Prior to that, been in the industry for almost 30 years. Mainly with one of the big vendors, and then a couple of years with an operator here in India. Within Mavenir, mainly with what we have an emerging business unit, and we definitely look at 5G, typically 5G enterprise solutions, which are actually under the radar as one of the 5G applications, not just for the MNOs, but also for the private network industry, private industries or industry applications. And that there is a lot of, what we see is a lot of traction. And as my colleague Marko Bebovic in the morning session did introduce, looking at 5G and the entire ecosystem, we are on an open platform. Collaboration and is what we look at all across the entire chain of, let's say, if I look at all the way from the radio unit heads to the DUCU and towards also the platforms such as we have our own web scale platform, Red Hat, and others as well that we work with. So as a company, we are completely, that's what we work with on the openness. And I do believe that eventually we will have open source. We are getting into a position of starting on the curve of let's say bigger deployments and reaching up to the maturity stage, and eventually as the industry and complete it gets much more, industry gets more comfortable. I would say they are already operators are already committing to Open RAN, and as they get in much more comfortable with the concepts and they look at the benefits that come out of this new architecture, I do believe that going forward, may not be right now, but moving forward, this stage also, this would be the evolution from an openness perspective. When that would be, is I think it depends on a few factors. And in the context of hardware could be the first one, because we are such a TCO sensitive market, and maybe that is something that would be a driver from an Indian context. I would imagine.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jayant. Thank you so much. So let's move to sort of say one of the incumbent vendors, and Nokia, and ask Vikesh to share his thought on the large vendor perspective.
Yeah, thanks, Inder. So myself, Vikesh Sharma, I am heading the radio solutions for India market in Nokia. And I mean, of course, O-RAN is a new technology, so of course, this is one of the areas we are closely working on. And as you know, I mean, this is not the new thing for Nokia. I mean, so openness. I mean, just imagine this OPSI, Open Base Station Architecture Initiative. We introduced early 2000, so that was the first time we introduced. So we were already supporting this openness as a concept. But of course, I mean, it takes time to mature and other things. And I believe that even in the O-RAN side, I mean, it will take its own time. So to get standards to get evolved and things like that. In terms of open source, what we see is that clearly it has a space in this 5G ecosystem, but it may not touch end-to-end of the 5G. We clearly see that maybe on the application side, for example, this ONAP, which is basically the Open Network Automation Platform, the O-RAN Alliance, and then we have this near real-time RIC, RAN Intelligent Controller. So those are some of the areas where we really see this open source will. And for some of the other areas, like when we talk about CU, DU, RU, I mean, I think that is something what is a bit challenging, and these challenges are mainly twofold. First one, of course, as we know that even though 5G is based on standards or the radio technologies are based on standards, the algorithms are so complex to implement with open source, and this is one challenge there. And with 5G evolving, I think this is even more complex, because even if you see the 5G algorithms, these are even more complex. We have this beamforming coming to play, massive MIMO, those type of things. So it's a bit tricky there. The second bit from this radio point of view is basically that if you look at this existing networks what we are having worldwide, we have 2G, 3G, 4G already there. So, and there is a certain end user experience what operators are already providing to their subscribers. So of course we really need to make sure that this parity issue is taken care of whenever we move towards this openness and this new platforms. So, and this parity issue with the existing technologies, just to make sure that, I mean, whatever the real this end user experience is not impacted. This is something what we see again to be implemented on the radio side. But yes, as a summary, we clearly see open source has a role to play in this 5G ecosystem with ONAP and near real-time RIC as the clear areas there. And I think there is even in the O-RAN Alliance there is a open source software community, if I'm not wrong, which is dealing with these type of issues and evaluating this open software feasibility in those areas. Yeah.
Great, thanks, Vikesh. So I think your view is that open source will emerge, but only in certain application area, RIC and so forth, but not in actually the core network infrastructure. And we'll come back to that and maybe push on that a little bit later on in the session. So the next speaker, the next panelist is from STL. So Rajesh, let me turn it over to you, and please introduce yourself and give us your perspective.
Sure. Yeah. Thanks, Inder. Rajesh Gangadhar. I sort of head the tech function for the business unit within STL that really focused on open networking principles. So all of our solutions and products are driven by open networking solutions. So for one, I'll speak to the affirmative and take off from where Timo left off. I truly believe that in order to bring out the best in 5G of what the promise is of 5G and beyond, you do need a larger ecosystem of partners and solutions coming in, and the only way you can do that is to have the ability to tap into open source. Where that fits in, how that fits in, and when is something that will be driven by the industry as a whole. But I can tell you that every one of our products, whether it is the the programmable FTTX solutions, which is essentially a virtualized stack that can run on white box solution, that's a single software-enabled broadband access-based code, and we just curated, we have matured it, we've added a lot of features and functionality to it, and it's ready for GA in a few months. So we've actually gone through that entire development cycle to bring that product out. Similarly, the RIC, as some of the other panelists mentioned, we have already developed the MVP near real-time RIC, and are now developing the non-real-time RIC and the SMO functions. And in all of this, the only reason STL could even venture into the space is because we could tap into the larger ecosystem of openness and platforms that were available that we could curate and mature those products. So really, I think to me, it really speaks to the ability, lowering the barrier of entry for innovation, increasing the innovators in this ecosystem, reducing the technology, seeing the adoption rate of these innovations. So, but having said that, what can make this more mainstream? I think that was one of the comments as well earlier. Well, I think for a long time, Timo mentioned since the 90s, open source solutions have mentored. I mean, they've been done research in university domain. But in the last 2.5 years, you've seen this flurry of activity bringing all of the capabilities around open sourcing into a collaborative framework. So I really believe that succeed in this realm is to bring a collaboration, partnership, because, and I think Satish had shown a slide where there was a vertical integration, horizontal integration, because some of the challenges that we foresee ourselves is how do you integrate horizontally and vertically, right? So we need that partnership framework that comes together, and we're not saying it's not. In fact, I'm pleasantly surprised in the last 26, 27 years in the industry, for the first time, everyone just wants this to succeed, and that it's not just the operators, but the players, the key players in the ecosystem as well. So I strongly believe that open sourcing is, what it means for India is that it actually enables the startup ecosystem, which there are many in India. Traditionally, we've all worked for multinational corporations and run R&D for those corporations. Nothing wrong with that. I'm just saying what it does is it actually allows a lot of companies such as Sukta, there's Sankhya, there's a lot of other companies out there that have very niche capabilities, and now it allows them to be a player in this ecosystem. Previously, that was just not possible. So I feel that it has evened the playing field. And I think as we 3 years, you will see that we wouldn't even be having this conversation. We would just say that, yeah, this is it. This is the reality, I think. So, yeah. Thanks.
Thank you, Rajesh. Thank you. Interesting perspective. Our next speaker, next panelist is from a traditional large software vendor, Vinod. So maybe Vinod, you'd like to share from VMware. Vinod, you'd like to share your perspective.
Absolutely, Inder. Can you hear me well?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
All right.
Very well.
So thanks for the opportunity. So my name is Vinod Joseph. I'm the technical leader and telco strategist based in APJ. I'm actually based in Singapore, and I'm glad to be here. I think I agree with most of what everyone said here about open source. I think it's definitely been the glue that's brought the industry together, that has built consensus, that has driven open interfaces and standards to that effect. But I would also, I think the need of the are is open architectures in addition to open interfaces or open source or open standards. And what I mean by open architectures is, if you look at anything cloud native today, Kubernetes, right, which is the de facto platform for any application, be it 5G or the RAN, it's no more looked at as a platform. It is a framework, as a way of actually building and deploying applications and scaling them. So it's a cloud native way of actually running your business or services. And I think that's the key here. So what we need is maybe more contribution from ISVs, from the different vendors and industry as well, in making services that we are building, be it for the core or be it for the RAN, are pretty much aligned to cloud native principles, right? It couldn't just be that you build an application on a Kubernetes platform, you have the best of breed tools and mechanisms around it, but the application is not built to it. It's not really capable of leveraging some of the advantages that this platform or infrastructure can provide. So I think it's actually one of the top priorities. What we also see is some sort of a convergence in many of these architectures that are being proposed, because traditionally I can talk about any telco application or network function that you deploy essentially comes with its element management system, it comes with its own operations and management tools and so on and so forth. We need to sort of take a step back and say, maybe as part of the evolution, we need to bring this back into how a traditional application would be built on a cloud native platform. As an example, I can say, why not deploy this as a Kubernetes operator? Why not you deploy your controllers, your management systems as software that can be abstracted from an ADP or an ISV, right? This actually will reduce the total cost of ownership completely, right? Because I think today, if you look at the challenges that we have, and most of the discussions around, is Open RAN great? Can it actually live up to what a traditional RAN infrastructure could be providing in terms of performance and scale and optimization and so on based environment? And the answer is always yes, it could. We're trialing this in so and so place. There isn't a firm answer that we can say that, hey, Open RAN in the next 1 year potentially is going to be a very viable alternate to a fixed or traditional RAN deployment, right? So my point being here, we cannot look at it as impressive as what Open RAN has been trying to do as a second-line citizen or a second-in-class citizen, right? And especially if you look at the Indian market, I think Open RAN has its tremendous applicability, whether you call it on densification of your existing 4G infrastructure or deploying it for rural locations or private. It has massive potential, and I think we need to really look at it from an industry standpoint, vendors, solution providers, SIs, CSPs, telcos, all of them together as to how we can optimize the full stack. And I think, like my panelists said, most of the optimization around open source today is either at the platform. To a limited extent, there is still a lot of competition in the orchestration. There's large opinions, whether it's ONAP or OSM or whatnot there. So I think the only convergence has been at the O cloud, at the platform layer. So there's a lot of work that we have to do as an industry, especially for a country like India. But I think we're getting there. There is no doubt that over a period of time, a lot of it will be practically as the most mature and deployable solutions, and all of them would be having a vast majority of an open source component to it. Okay.
Great. Thank you, Vinod. I guess we'll move to Anil from Altiostar. Could you share your perspective on this? See, I guess
I'm sorry, Chair. Mr. Anil have another engagement, so he is not available today.
Okay, all right. Prakash, let's move to you. John?
Hello, am I audible?
Yes, you're audible. Please go ahead.
Thank you. I'm Prakash. I'm part of TSDSI. I'm the vice chair of the study group network. I'm also been in CROT for 27 years. I coordinate the RAN activities along with being a member of strategic planning committee and technology roadmaps in CROT. So coming to open source, I've been an open source proponent forever from '94. I started using Linux in '94, GCC somewhere that time frame. The reason was just because that was having access and I could fiddle with it. That's how we got started. It was not like we could experiment it. And as we start looking at the industry, what we have seen in the telecom industry, when you see the number of vendors that were there at 2G, maybe it was in 50, 100, whatever, it was pretty large. And as we moved to 3G, and then by the time we reached 4G, at the end of 4G, probably the only 5 large players left, which has sort of led to exhaustion in the industry in terms of the operators and the ecosystem. The bandwidth that the 5 companies can provide to the operations, I think is hitting a limit, which is allowing a lot of, the people who were there in Omni, they sort of broke up, have still the knowledge and the interest and the enthusiasm to again get together and put something back. And that is what I think what looks for, and in the end, when things get very big, they start breaking apart. And that is what has happened they've gone so big and the system has got so complex that feature addition and so on. So maybe it's time for it to disaggregate and start putting it. And open source is the easiest way to get started. And one of the things open source provides is it makes things grow beyond what the creator can think of. I don't know whether Linus Torvalds thought that Linux should be so big. And it sort of allows, even now, let's say a telco creates, a OEM creates a product. He says the RAN should be like this. Should it be limited to that company's vision of the product? The 100 crore for doing R&D, let's say $10 million and builds a product. Should he be allowed to restrict, because when the operator is putting, let's say, $200, $500 million worth of equipment, does he not have any say in how the equipment evolves? So this is something that open source allows, and then someday the $100 million company might shut down and go away. What do all the other people do? The people who are invested around the ecosystem. So that is one thing that open source allows for a long-term, sustenance of that around that ecosystem, and it can probably grow beyond what anybody can think. In terms of how do we see open source faster, I use this, anything that comes from outside in, that is external interfaces, things that interface with outside entities, they will come in first. Then, anything which is or architecturally already envisaged and seen by the outside and application layer, and then you start going downwards to the lower layers of the hardware. Maybe L3 and above will be easier. And as you go down, the EMS, NMSs are easier. That is what is going to become as a RIC or near-time RIC and so on. Okay. And as you start non-real-time RIC, as you start going down, they will take longer and a little bit more time to be getting open source. Again, open source, usually even now when people talk about, they're almost always restricting it to software. I think if you see what's happening in the OCP, the RISC, OpenRISC and so on, maybe you'll start from somewhere, you will start with the EMS, but in the end, the direction is that you will open source and microcode. So when you start bringing it that, again, here also, even in the hardware, you'll start with the external interfaces first, and then you start going in. Because even in the processor, should it be that Intel has all the knowledge of what everybody should do in the world? Can you put FPGA plus the FPGA and a ARM processor together and do something, RISC processor? So how do we decide what is, the future, and how should it be? Should it be left to the 5-10 companies to decide what the whole world does? So that is the aspect that we start looking. From all these things, the radio aspect is a little bit of an issue because the infrastructure required to test it, the knowledge required, the complexity, and also the general availability of RF and analog engineers. I think even in the young engineers we meet around about other countries, the interest to pick up RF and the other areas is lesser compared to say software and so on. So that's why there's a lot more talk of containerization and other aspects and less about RF and so on. But in wireless you still have to do. So again, if you talk in terms of this, the open source will start from the core side and then come back to, and if you start drawing some lines outside to inside, top to down, software to hardware, and external architectural elements towards internal and so on. Okay. So these are my initial thoughts, and as the discussion progresses, we can pick up on the other threads.
Great, thank you. I think set a very nice framework for some subsequent discussion. So let us go to our final panelist, Ambarish from Sukta. Ambarish has been leading the application subgroup in the on open source. So Ambareesh, would you like to share your view?
Yeah, thank you, Inder. I hope you can hear me well, clear?
Yes, we can hear you very well.
Okay. Just myself, Ambareesh, I'm the Director of Engineering at Sukta. As Inder mentioned, I've been actively participating in for open source and TSDSI. At Sukta, let me give you a practical view of what we went through in our initial phases. So Sukta, a 10-year-old company, when we started building 4G solutions, and then we were primarily software-centric set of core team there during that time. And as a startup, then our focus was always try to see where we can optimize the cost, where we can reduce a lot of investment in the test equipment. So that is where our first instance where the open source came into play. So it was then we started those tools that are available primarily in the RAN space. We wanted to test some of those base station functionalities, and then we started using. So I think we realized that the open source is going to be something that is really helpful for startups like us. It is very effective, and in terms of validation, and also if you have to compete with validation across doing interoperability testing using the open source solutions was a big plus for us. We were able to quickly adapt and test with commercial devices. I mean, it was a lot of practical learning experience for us, how important the open source played for us as a company in its upgrow. Some of the people who spoke in the last session were highlighting key challenges about the ORAN. So there were questions about truly openness. Some of the hardware is evolving, and a lot of use case validation that has to be done. So as a operator or somebody who is an OEM or ODM who's going to invest a lot of R&D effort, realizing, evaluating all this, I think that is where the open source is going to play a key part. So you get now the way in which open source is defined. If I have to talk about the recent learnings that we got from the open source study, there's a lot of adaptation to the standardization that the open source ecosystem is doing. There is also a lot of industry partners are participating in the open source ecosystem. One key aspect that we have seen as a company is expertise in the telecom domain is a valuable thing. All the companies, including the big ones and the small startups and the mid players, all of them realize that getting expertise is one of the biggest open source. There again, having global collaboration and building open source components is one way of adapting and getting those expertise in-house as well. So if the company embraces the open source ecosystem, there's one way you also are getting those expertise to the in-house. The other addition that we have seen is the open source ecosystem with respect to development methodologies adapting to the continuous integration, continuous development, CSID. They are also building end-to-end systems. So that way you get a full-fledged end-to-end system that you can use, and then if there is somewhere you want to do interoperability test, or you wanted to do also adapt it, use it, and also commercialize it, and it is a big plus to start with. So that is one way. And additionally, also the way in which the open source systems are being built, it is mostly hardware independent focus, basically. So it is more of an ORAN. I would say ORAN and open source both are going hand in hand at the same point at which into the telecom system ecosystem. It is a big advantage. So I would say open source, yes, it is going to be a big player. It has started off at the right time, but I think it is going to be helpful in the 5G ecosystem in a big way. Some of those initial components that we can adapt are the core part, the CU, the RIC applications. These are those ecosystems coming to play quicker rather than compared to. There are some challenges with respect to the DU, and the RU parts, but I think that can be something that can be addressed. So we start with the simplistic components that are available, core or CU or some of those RIC applications, and then eventually we can migrate towards the complex systems. So there are challenges. We have seen with our own personal evaluation, we have gone through the source code, so open source software, we have tested them, tried them well. There are some architecture and design complexities that needs to be solved. Some of those greenfield deployments, for example, if it is a greenfield deployment, the open source is fine, but also supporting legacy networks, that is the biggest challenge. There are a lot of questions about the maturity, and again, I think with a lot of industry participation, all these points can be addressed in the open source ecosystem. So the answer to your question, Inder, yeah, I think it is going to be a big player to open source in the current telecom domain. And I think with the help of the industry, win-win situation for all of them, especially for somebody who wants to develop and work on niche areas in the telecom domain. It definitely is a big bonus.
Great. Thank you, Ambrish. So I think a very interesting perspective from everyone. Probably 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 kind of emphatic yeses, and then one kind of maybe, I guess, the Nokia perspective was sort of a little bit on the fence. But kind of let's elaborate on that. I think, Prakash, actually, before I do that, let me just mention to the audience, we have, I think, a technique for the audience to send questions. So through the chat, they'll get relayed to us over here, and then I can put them to the panelists. So the audience at this point to type in their questions, and we'll select them and put them to the panel as we go forward. But anyway, let's continue the discussion. I think Prakash actually had a few, I think, which I think about maybe delving into a little bit deeper. I think one thing he said is that open source is a way of making sure that a few companies do not dominate and do not drive the industry. And which really means, to me, it's sort of breaking incumbency, sort of democratizing, opening on innovators, perhaps smaller innovators. And I mean, do you see this way? And I'd be very interested in, actually many of the perspectives. Maybe we can start with Timo, and then perhaps Vikesh, to hear his viewpoint, and then anyone else who wants to jump in. I'm going to talk a little bit about that. And is this a way of opening up the industry of the ecosystem? Is this a way really of getting smaller players to participate, and perhaps reducing the clout of some of the large vendors?
Yeah, absolutely. I absolutely agree. And we have seen the proof points already in NFV, which is, I always come back to NFV. Whether it's highly successful or not, we can debate on that. But the idea of NFV is to split the software stack and allow other people, smaller vendors, bigger vendors, in their technologies, network functions, management tools, platforms, and all that stuff. And so I think that's open source is a good way to do that. And what we are doing now in 5G and O-RAN is providing the cloud platforms, and by default, the cloud platform is open source. And that's one of my kind of favorite topics, because if we do have an open source platform all the way in 5G core network and BSS and all the way to the edge, I'm not meaning that from one company, the topic, but from the based on the similar open source technology like Kubernetes, container orchestration, and all the tools around it. If we have all that in place in open source, really provided by different companies, then that would benefit to the whole ecosystem, benefits to the network function vendors, small and big, because they would know that, hey, there is a network built out which is based on open source Kubernetes container platform and orchestration. So I know what that means. I know that my network function or my workload, it works on Kubernetes container platform. In this, this time it's from Red Hat, at this time it's from some other company, but it's still based on the same open source, community releases. Little bit differences, of course, we know that they are not exactly the same framework. And I think Vinod from VMware was saying that open architectures are equally important than open source itself. And this, I guess, proves the point that we have things based on the same open source projects and implemented by commercial companies for you. So people start seeing consistency and commonality, and the horizontal architecture in implementing the use cases or network use cases in 5G and Open RAN. So I think open source plays very on the platform level. You know, of course, we as Red Hat, we provide platforms. That's the only thing we do. And we keep it very clear that that is the only thing we do. We do not mess up with the RAN vendors. So we are partnering with Nokia and Ericsson, Mavenir, Altiostar, everybody, and we don't. We just provide the consistent platform for everybody, RAN and core and IT as well, of course.
Thanks, Timo. Vikesh, do you have a perspective on that question?
Yeah. Maybe I can share my views a bit. When we talk about, first of all, this is something what will diversify the overall ecosystem in terms of the vendor. It will provide flexibility to the operators to select the vendors, help in supply chain. It will drive innovations, and it will also help operators somehow to reduce the cost points, which is very important when we talk about complexities in the networks where we have multiple frequencies, multiple radio access technologies there. So of course, and to have a viable business case, I think we need to have this cost point down. And this is ORAN or openness is something what is really promising in that way. But how we see that is, the standard has to drive it. So I'm coming from the ORAN perspective first, then I'll go to the open source. So the standards has to really drive this, and we really need to make sure that the industry as a whole is mature enough to adopt those standards. And so maybe it will take some time when this ORAN will really, but of course, but it is definitely going to help. The ecosystem. Now coming to open source. When in my previous comment, I was mainly relating with the ORAN framework from the open source point of view. So when we talk about ORAN, so we have, let's say, RU, we have a DU, distributed unit, then we have CUs, the big RAN intelligent controller, and then on top of that, we have this ONAP, right? That's a broad level framework of ORAN. So when we talk about this open source, so as I commented, this RU, CU, DU, bringing open source in there because those are basically dealing with this layer 1, layer 2, layer 1. DU is doing layer 1, layer 2 blended. CU is doing layer 2, layer 3. So, and all those the algorithms are that complex in the radio side that it's very hard to implement this open source on that one. And those are the areas where vendors would like to differentiate from each other, and they would like to to their products. So definitely, so it will be difficult for vendors to implement this open source in those three domains. But yes, it has clearly a role to play when we talk about the management layer, which is basically the near real-time brick, as I said, and then the ONAP. ONAP. Those are something what we can call as less differentiating fields. Maybe open source can play a big role and provide more flexibilities and get those things into a harmonized manner, which is currently missing. That's what.
Yeah, but just to kind of push a little bit on that, right? The thinking really was that, hey, look, and if you look at the 5G space, it's particularly true, right? There are a few vendors that pretty much dominate the space, right? Nokia being one of them, right? At this point, and is open source going to increase the number of vendors? And is that a good thing for Nokia? Would you see that as a positive? Or do you see that potentially as a threat to your business model?
I will not comment in that direction. I would really comment in a direction that whether at this point in time, whether it would make sense for operators who has, let's say, legacy 2G, 3G, 4G in there, and then they have to move to 5G. So whether it's really a feasible solution, in the near term, let's say maybe it's a very long term, maybe things can change, but in near term, maybe that level of flexibility, because they have to ensure 3G, 4G, and they have to make sure that whatever end user experience they're providing to the subscribers, that is not getting impacted while moving to the open systems. So, so whether that level of parity can be ensured by the open source, that's the biggest question. So, or open source or open ecosystem. So it's mainly, I'm talking about the time to market when it's a question of timing, not really the feasibility.
Any other perspective on the panel, and anyone else wants to share a thought on that particular topic?
Yeah.
Yeah, Rajesh, maybe you wanted to say something?
Yeah, sure.
So, just to comment on what Vikesh said and in the earlier part as to where the open source plays into, let's say, the Open RAN, ORAN stack or the ORAN architecture today. That is what Mavneer itself is deploying. What you refer to L1, L2, L3, because at the heart of any RAN company, the scheduler is where you have your, that's the heart of the RAN. And to see that coming in, and that's how you distinguish yourself from at the meat of it with the competition. Everything else you do have. I mean, as Timo mentioned, we are one of their partners, as we are partners with VMware and with other players like Wind River, on which we deploy our cloud native RAN as well as our core applications and systems. Getting into open source for some of those things, I think, this is a leap of faith that, because the way the entire industry is moving into, in a new way of collaboration and with open source, I believe personally it will eventually reach and happen is something. I think that's going to take quite a bit of time to reach, but the beginning has been made as you have ability to work on any hardware, on any software, or any platform. I think an industry is maturing. There are a lot of announcements now. We have Dish, as we've mentioned before, as well as the recent announcements by other operators in Europe, for instance, and then of course, so it is coming up to that stage. Plus, we've had deployments. It's not like India is not, there haven't been any sort of deployments here in India to verify, to test, etc. And so I believe that it will eventually happen, but that takes its time in there.
Okay. Did you want to add anything, Rajesh, or anyone else?
Yeah, and I was just on similar lines. I think to get to the PHY and the MAC layer of a particular protocol, I think we're a little away from that right now, and that actually brings back, will open source in and of itself be successful without some conformance to an industry forum or standardization, and whether the industry needs a parallel standard to what 3GPP is driving is another question. So, and I think so there are elements of open source or solutions that can implement, whether it's in RIC or whether it's in other upper layers of the architecture, and that makes a lot of sense because a lot of cost capex is also spent and opex is also spent there, so you can leverage some of the better TCOs there. But to get to the physical and MAC layer protocol definitions, I think that just means because without a standard, meaning some sort of a technical conformance spec, it's going to be a really chaos at that layer. So I think because then you have to also think about the devices on the handhelds and the other things. So that's the other piece. So I think we're a little away from that, but certainly certain elements could be brought in. Protocols could be open source elements to it. Jayant mentioned the scheduler. That could be something that you can bring an open source scheduler into your platform, right? So that goes back to your what the silicon can support, whether it's a DSP or the FPGA. So
yeah, I just have a comment on that. I think what they're saying, we've got to look at it as to how far open source will take us here, right? I mean, do we want to really change everything? Do we want to really change the applications? Do we want to kind of change the behavior of the protocols, the system architectures? I think that's kind of pushing the envelope a little too far. What maybe personally I would like to see here is always been the theme of driving innovation, and open source has been a very integral part of that. You talk about SDN, which actually resulted in NFV, and then NFV actually created this whole new ecosystem of different players providing software functions, and then now we are seeing the segregation in different parts of the network, right? So that's kind of giving room for open as a potential alternate here. The one thing maybe I would personally like to see a little more engagement from the industry is the telcos' contribution or the telcos' participation in open source projects. I think that's very important. If you look at what's happening at the CNCF for Kubernetes vendors, all of our partners here are there. But the CSP contribution, I wouldn't say contribution, participation is a little limited, right? So we need more participation there, because that's the place where you're going to develop new architectures and methods of actually running your applications and services. The other part I would think is we need to draw on the software layers that sit above the applications, ONAP and OSM or anything around orchestration, or even the SMOs. I mean, that's a classical example where you could have this entire scope broadened up, right? I mean, because I think if I look at, maybe ONAP, what ONAP is doing or what OSM is doing, you see a lot of conflict so as an operator, there's always this big question. There are lovely open source projects there, but what really fits my environment? Should I go for option A or option B? Because these are both open source projects. So we need more collaboration there and more industry participation there. Because if you look at orchestration, it's largely driven by telcos. You have very limited industry participation. So I think you need to broaden the scope across areas where open source can actually provide the benefit. And I think you've already seen the benefits through disaggregation. So anything in the network moving forward which gets disaggregated, unquestionably open source will be a part of it. But I think trying to push the envelope and say everything has to be open source, that may not be effective. Yeah. Go ahead, sorry, please.
So, Timo, you want to add something?
Yeah, I would like to add to what Vinod said, what Vikesh said. So first of all, we have to remember that open source is not easy. It's not an easy thing. It's a very complex thing to do when you have a complex software systems based on open source. It's not easy. And one of the biggest challenges, which I think Vinod touched upon, is to build an ecosystem around the open source project. So there are tons of open source projects which are one company things, and I don't even know those are, and they are not typically very valuable. But open source becomes valuable when you can bring and build the ecosystem around the project itself and bring in various players like service providers and vendors and system integrators, you name it. When those project and product based on open source project is going to be successful. So there's so many different things around that thing. And to contribute to open source project, it's not just writing code. You can contribute by documentation, developing training packages, do marketing or promotion on open source. So anybody or most of the companies can do that. But of course, the core is to build the code, but that's not the only thing. So that's one thing I wanted to say, and that's a challenging thing. But if that happens, it will almost be guaranteed, maybe not quite, but almost. The other thing, coming back to what Vikesh was saying earlier, with open source, you can do very, very complex things. And I'm not talking about beamforming algorithms, those are complex, so we are not doing that. My own personal interest is very close to that, but Red Hat doesn't do that. But what we do, which is decided by Oran Alliance as one interesting data point, is that Oran Alliance has decided to put the timing and synchronization chain to the responsibility of OCloud, decouple that from the RAN workloads. And that's what I'm working right now to build the timing and sync chain into Red Hat Container Platform, having all these grandmaster clocks and border clocks and precision time protocols and sync E protocols. And all these protocols, of course, they are done on user space kind of achieving the clock accuracy, which is very tough thing to do, depending on what ORAN timing profile people want to use. And there are quite a few. There are 4 profiles. They have different kind of subcategories, and it's a very challenging thing to do. But timing is, as we all know, it's fundamentally important for time division duplex networks, and that's just an example of how open source can also contribute in complex topics. Yeah.
Great, thank you. I think one thing that Vinod mentioned actually kind of like to pose a question based on that to the group. Vinod talked about the lack of carrier participation, right, in efforts, and he said it would be great if there's more participation. Do you and it seems to me that, you know, I recall, for example, AT&T made a big announcement, you know, a few years ago, you know, saying, hey, our entire network is going to be open source, right? I mean, we're going to take anything to the network that is not based upon open source. I don't know how many other carriers have followed suit, but do you see pull from the carriers? You see kind of encouragement? It seems to me that it would be really in the carrier's interest, and probably the carrier should be the primary driver of open source movement to open. Do you see that happening? Maybe put it to all of you guys. I mean, you see that happening as you talk to the carriers. You're all kind of representing vendors, I think. Maybe start perhaps, you know, Rajesh, would you like to comment on that, and then we can go to the others?
Sure. Yeah, no point you brought up. I mean, the carrier or operator participation is fundamental to the success of this this entire enterprise. So, but to your point, there has been an increase in participation. Let me put it this way: there were early adopters. AT&T, obviously, you mentioned that. Telefonica, Deutsche Telekom. Various consortiums. There's the Telecom Infra project. Facebook has been really pushing a lot of this open source, open architecture sort of concepts. So, and then there's the ONF, ONAP. All of those are primarily anchored around operators. So the operators have been playing a role. In the recent past is that they're actually now really thinking about rolling it out in the field. I mean, previously it was still you know, CTO organizations driving some of these niche developments, and slowly, you know, and of course AT&T has been in the forefront, so has you know, Deutsche Telekom, but now these RFIs coming out that are calling for open networking solutions, based solutions, whether it's fixed access or wireless access. Is this enough? Probably not. We'd love to see more, and I say that because when we do invest in developing solutions that are open networking based or open source based, as upfront, and we want to get a fair bit of sense that there is an operator at the end of, or operators at the end, that are going to go and roll this out in the network. So yeah, that really means that the operators have to drive the requirement set that need to come in, and then you can still leverage open source to bring those requirements and maybe you know, differentiate and how they implement it, you know, and bring some of their secret sauce in there. So, but having said that, you know, the most recent announcement last week, I think it was that Telefonica, Deutsche Telekom, and Vodafone, they've actually set out an Open RAN requirement set, and it's publicly a first step. Now we know there's a blueprint to go and look at. Okay, what can you develop? What do you need? What can you do in what time frame? So I feel it is changing. You know, and even through the pandemic, that has evolved. That's quite impressive. So I feel like in the next 2 to 3 years, you'll see most operators having at least some deployments that are networking centric. You know, we see that.
Yeah, I just have one comment on that. Inder, I think I agree with what Rajesh said, but I slightly differ on the telco participation angle, and I'll tell you why. I think any open source project, for it to be successful, it needs to have industry consent. So many open source projects which have not necessarily been very successful, even though they've been some of the best. I mean, I don't want to bring in names. So you need to build industry consensus. And I think what's happening with some of the projects which are like very European centric, or you know, only led by Vodafone as an example, I'm just giving you a name. It may be, right, because necessarily use cases, the applicability of that particular solution doesn't really fit into the Indian market, right? So I think what we need is more consensus. You know, CSPs or telcos actually driving the industry towards that consensus and making that open source project like what happened to Kubernetes, right? We're going to have everybody in the industry who's built consensus that this is going to be the O cloud. And if you look at what's happened and the impact that has had over the standards body, is that 3GPP and the others have come out and said when 5G came out that this has to be based on cloud native principles. It has to be based on a service-based architecture. All of that mirrors the success. And the reason why it's been very successful is because of the industry consensus that it has built around the different parties. So my take on saying CSP participation was more as being people who drive consensus, not necessarily building new solutions. You don't need to come up with a new project just for saying that I've built this or I need people. Build consensus and provide direction in terms of how that applicability or how it should evolve for certain use cases. Because if I look at it today, if I take an example of one open source orchestration platform, is that going to be applicable for me as a CSP to deploy it for my RAN workloads, core workloads? Maybe, may not be. And again, the industry is saying, this is where we converge in building a orchestration framework. So I think we need to move away from saying it's an open source orchestrator into saying it's an open source orchestration framework. It's centered around industry and open architectures, like what Kubernetes and cloud native and everything around that has become. I think that's the drive consensus and agreement towards building frameworks out of which products can come. Then it doesn't matter whether it comes from vendor A or vendor B. They will all be aligned to a particular industry framework. Very much like today, VMware packages Kubernetes, Red Hat and so Wind River, and all of these have Kubernetes distributions, but they are all allowed, right? So do not make any changes or if I can say proprietary extensions that drastically change the deployment behavior. I think that's pretty much my view on the contribution from CSP side.
So is that consensus going to be operator driven or vendor driven?
It has to be operator. I think that's what we are seeing with Open RAN. I mean, if you do not have the impetus that operators have with some of the initiatives under Open RAN, DT, and of course, notwithstanding the operators in India as well, I do not think Open RAN would have been where it is today. It would have been another open architecture initiative or something around disaggregation, right? It wouldn't be there. Into SDN as an example. SDN by itself had great momentum, but it kind of turned out into a vendor-specific interpretation and implementation of its technology. So SDN, you have vendor A's SDN, vendor B's SDN, and some of the open source projects became just projects. They were not frameworks around how SDN should be built and delivered. We don't want that to happen to ORAN. We want Open RAN to be creating the democracy that is creating, building that ecosystem, and serving as a guiding principle in how open and disaggregated radio access networks should be built. I think that's how I look at it.
Right. Prakash, you want to say something? Yeah, please go ahead.
Yes. So a couple of things. One is there is, of course, operator interest. In fact, ORAN as alliance was created because of operator backlash. It was not the vendors who got together. If you look at it, there were a lot of operators who got. In fact, and when we talked to some of them, including people in Africa, they were fed up of the control and the power the OEMs held, including the OEMs would deploy. It was complete black boxes, and they would save money and so on. And after some time, the AMC costs were so high, and you couldn't get in, you couldn't get out. So the backlash came it's almost like some fight for freedom. That's how that's how the open source looks like the solution and direction in which. So ORAN program is a milestone in the direction towards open source. And if the argument is that something can be only done in closed source and not in open source, that is something I personally don't buy. I mean, how is it that 20 people can sit together in one office? They will be able to crack, but let's say 100 people, 500 people collaborating will not be able to crack. That is something as an argument. It's difficult to find. And these days we are all working from home, whether you're in a closed source or open source. I mean, the tools are same, minds are the same, and so on. It's a matter of getting the aggregation. And in terms of vendor space, if you check out the IT, the large IT project, for example, Airtel gave a $700 million contract to IBM for maintaining their IT systems. And if you see it all along top to bottom, maybe there are a lot of open source there. Okay. But as a system integrator and so on, if somebody is picking it up, now you could do the same thing for here. And the IT biggies right now, the Indian, if you check out the space in India, all the large IT players have ambition and actually have started work in the past 2, 3, 4 years to create 5G labs and so on. 5G is just another technology for them, but I think they put the money, they are all in the right places and they are working in the direction to become a telco equipment maintainer, equipment integrator. They're first level, they're trying to become system integrators, system testers, deployment, maintain, and so on. For them, they're trying to see, okay, where is the next business coming in? Operators' confidence is driven by the fact that there is muscle and hands on the ground, which can actually implement their vision or their direction. So you can't just have a vision and there's nobody else to help. Then you'll have to again go back to the 5 players. So now if the people put their hands up and say yes, the vendor ecosystem, the open source players, they all get together. I think that's where it's like a you ask because somebody is giving is how you could implement it, and it's bi-directional, reflexive.
Great, thank you. We may be running out of time, right? So I don't know. I mean, I can see our host over there, and are we out of time? Okay, I'm not sure.
Shashi sir, could you be a little louder?
We can't hear you, Shashi. Shashi, we cannot hear you at all. Just give an indication. How much time do we have? I know we have 0 or.
May I intervene, sir?
Yeah, please.
I think we have 10 minutes more, up to 5:50. Yeah.
Okay. All right. So, yeah, please.
Yeah, I have one point to add to what.
Yeah, please. Yeah, Ambrish. Yeah, go ahead.
Timo said, and also to add to what Prakash said. So I think what one important point that Timo said is open source is not just about putting down the source code or writing code, but it is also implement or specification. Now, all of us have really embraced the ORAN, and then I think industry vendors, all the tier 1, tier 2, tier 3 companies have all agreed for ORAN. They're getting aligned. Now, there was also a point raised that the more key critical areas or the more proprietary, or what do they call as components are in the DU Mac scheduler. Now, I mean, there is still we can enhance the ORAN specific part to further to implementation of the bare metal implementation. Basically, at least say for example, specify Mac interfaces or put down the bare metal Mac implementation, which is nothing but a protocol. We could still export, pull out the interfaces, define the interfaces in the open source ecosystem, leave it to all the individual companies to put in their intelligence. If they want to put a smart algorithm in the scheduler, they want to do a little bit more enhancement in the SON, leave out those areas there. Basically, if somebody wants to contribute or they want to put in their proprietary implementations, we find the interfaces in the open source ecosystem such that it will give you that one. That way, if you see all the telcos, CSPs, Prakash was saying that there's a black box for most of them now. If they at least want to put in some of their proprietary implementations, algorithms, intelligence, each of those CSPs, they can still do it. I mean, we just give a first draft open source ecosystem which is not a full-fledged optimized infrastructure that is provided, but at least it will give you something that you can start with, and if you want to do a little bit more smarter, intelligent things, you can still do that one. So that is one point I would like to add.
Great, thank you. Now I don't know. Maybe I can ask the organizer. We had potentially said we could get some questions from the audience. I don't know if that's feasible, or I don't see anything appearing on the chat.
That's not feasible now.
Okay, that's not feasible. Okay. So, sorry, go ahead.
No, I said your concluding remarks so that we can end up the session.
Yeah. I was going to go to that. So let's maybe just go around the room. I think it's been a very interesting session. We've covered a whole bunch of different topics. I wanted to talk a little bit about actually another question that Prakash brought up, which I thought was interesting. He talked about, hey, how is open source going to emerge? And I think he referred to from outside in, maybe we can talk a little bit about that, and perhaps also Prakash, you can elaborate a little bit when you said open source is going to emerge from outside in. Elaborate a little bit about what you meant, and then perhaps give us a few concluding remarks, and then we'll go around the room similarly.
So when I say outside in, what I meant is in terms of you can start with the EMSs, or working from the element as you go closer to the hardware or closer to the product. And where typically what could be open source or what could be there is things you start with the obvious, and the architecturally in the standards defines a certain set of blocks, and set a certain what are the things that interface with say EMS in the RAN, what are the things that interface towards the core, so on. So you start those blocks and they become the first ones to start, this one, and then you start getting closer and closer. Some of them actually already talked about the things like schedulers and so on. I mean, there's no harm or problem. Meanwhile, the complex things can also be bundled out and kept it for the later, open source. So build a working function and then open source it. The people interested will not be willing to let go of it. It's a matter of time. So that's what I was talking about. You take an architecture block, and as the interfaces come in, the items that are interfacing with the other, and then you start going inwards. That is the first point I was talking about. Other thing is, considering that we have all the IT and the other industry people coming in, pushing it in terms of all the, they'll bring in their expertise in terms of HTTP, TLS, and those things that come with their comfort level, and then they will get into the other internal telco-related, telco-specific protocols a little later. I mean, it's not mandatory, but it's my thoughts. Okay, I could let.
Thank you. Do you have any other concluding remarks? Anything else to add?
In terms of, like I said earlier, it is not possible. The mind space that if you see, nowhere 5G says anything about open source. In the sense, no, it is just in the ecosystem. There was enough. There's burning desire. There's enough aspirations to put together and build. And then in the past few years, the amount of mind space that has got built up around open sourcing I think that is what will take the momentum towards building it. It's nothing, there's hardly what is 5G, it's another communication technology. The fact that there is so much interest in the ecosystem is what will drive the open source to the conclusion. That is my thoughts.
Thank you so much. So let's go around, maybe your response to that, and then your final thoughts on this.
Yeah, sure. Again, in open source, there are many different ways to use open source. As we all know, some just take the code and consume it and modify it, never contribute back. And our development model is, I think it's quite unique because we call it open source upstream first. So nothing ends up into our products unless it is in the community release first. That's why we call it upstream first. And of course, we are having discussions in telco industry on this topic because what it really means is that everything we develop in open source communities, and everything we develop is available to our competitors as well, whoever those might be. We know that well, and it's kind of a little bit double-edged sword. But we know that well. That's the model how we can really stay on the main line of community releases and not to diverge at all or as little as we ever can. So that's one thing I just wanted to point out. The other one is the O-RAN work. Case of work, of course, there's architecture work where we participate. There's a security working group where we participate. But the interface specification, there's only one interface which touches Red Hat or OCloud with this famous O2, which has been there has been a very controversial discussion within on how that should look like. And finally, it kind of converges very nicely now, or there's a very good potential to converge O2 into a usable interface. Ericsson and Nokia made a joint proposal weeks ago based on Kubernetes, existing Kubernetes interfaces as a model, and proposed that let's take that and let's look what are missing things and features, what the O-RAN implementation needs, and we stepped up and we started to back up what Ericsson and Nokia proposed, and hopefully we can get that forward and get you know, the OCloud place in ORAN solidified, if I may say so, as an open source platform.
Dr. Inder, the platform anytime, so please close it.
Yeah,
Because
okay.
we are extending minute to minute, so it will go off anytime. Yeah, please.
All right.
Yeah, I
didn't
have one.
Okay.
Yeah,
Vikesh, maybe you'd like to just talk quickly. I mean, and then we can, yeah.
Yeah. So.
Final thoughts.
I think. Yeah. So my ORAN is coming. I mean, it will be a next big thing in wireless. I would say ORAN, VRAN, whatever we say. The only question is the timing when it comes, because this needs really the industry as a whole to come, standards to evolve. So I think it will take time. So it will take its own time, and that is the time when really we can think about it, implementing. Open source, that is also something what is, again, can be a next big thing in telecommunication. It will disrupt this space as well. But yes, in terms of ORAN framework, it will start with, maybe the best way is to start with this own app and near real-time RIC, where it's easier to implement. Maybe radio, sometimes all the challenges, etc. Yeah.
Great, thank you. Vinod?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that you know, focus on total cost of ownership. That's going to be the key. Open source is a way, it's a means to reduce your TCO, but there could be other solutions as well that you may need to actually help you reduce those total cost of ownership. That's going to be the key. The next thing is, I think, moving into anything cloud native and this ecosystem is not about which technology, whether it's Kubernetes, whether it's CI/CD pipelines. It's about an operating environment. It's an operating model. It's a way of running your applications and services. So I think the ISP is incentivizing them to actually build their applications in tune with the platform and this cloud native ecosystem that, you know, stems from disaggregated stacks. That's going to be the second thing. The third thing is, as part of this, the evolution should take care to retire the legacy as much as we can. We cannot continue in open source and disaggregation and still retain the old ways of working, the EMSs, NMSs, the config management systems, and all of them, right? These have to converge into this new cloud native ecosystem. So I think this is a journey. Disaggregation is set off this theme. It's now realized that this has to be consistent across a different set of and telcos alike. And I think hopefully in the coming years, we will see that. How soon this would become a reality, it's up to a lot of these big vendors as well. I mean, they also would need to kind of drive this ecosystem to come to that stage of maturity. And I'm hoping that this will be a reality very soon.
Thank you.
Sure, yeah. So I'll just maybe one comment around what government can do to actually to help with this. If you look at the US, you know, there's a lot of talk about Open RAN and ORAN right up to the Congress, and there funding to encourage deployments and rollout of Open RAN, and the FCC is taking a lot of interest in this. The current chairwoman, she's kind of hosting an FCC showcase of Open RAN solutions. For India, it's in a similar manner. You know, while there are three major telcos who can certainly support and nurture, the government and regulatory authorities, DOT and such, must invest, create sandboxes, create initiatives, and incentivize the innovators to put the money in and drive this entire collaborative effort, because that's the only way it's going to be a dominant. We all know about how it's TCO driven, it's cost conscious, but there's a lot of investment involved here. So I think the government has a huge role to play in making sure that this succeeds. So yeah, I'll stop with that. Yeah, thanks for
just one last comment. Yeah, I agree with what Rajesh said in the US and the Congress, and similar support from our government here in India. Second aspect, I would say, Open RAN or ORAN is actually a reality now. You already have announcements by Dish. The first one was, although not the ORAN in the new phone announcement, and the sort of specification or the performance specification that these bunch of operators in Europe have published as well, and which is that they have published. So that's one. The second aspect, and in India, typically we have tradition, and what has now started showing up in India, for us who have grown up in the GSM era, it was all, you never found any Indian vendors, or you had Indian partners. Not in that sense, but now you see the likes of STL coming up. Entire ecosystem, although open source and all of that is a part. What also needs to be paid attention to is actually, to get companies to make radio heads here in India. And I think that would be, as we have competition in every domain of that stack or of the framework, we need to have companies bloom here in India as well in that very crucial part of the ecosystem for making 5G also a success, but keeping in mind the, how here in India.
Thank you. So let's end with Ambarish, maybe a couple of quick words, and then we can wrap up.
Yeah. So I think one other way the open source can contribute is towards the standardization, basically. So if we can have open source based test, we could actually contribute to the standardization, do a lot of experiments. That is one way. And secondly, also hardware evolution, which is a big cost that the CSPs would incur. So I think if they have to invest in all the hardware, considering the ORAN, I think it makes sense to adopt open source and do a little bit more experiment, come up with the hardware that actually they can invest into. So with that, I would like to.
I really appreciate all of you spending this time, and sorry that we got so delayed, and I guess the way the scheduling, I guess, was kind of pushed the session to a much later point. But thank you for staying with it, and hopefully we'll continue this dialogue outside of this forum. Thank you all. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
For
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.